It was one of the most startling covers ever published by Time magazine. On April 8, 1966, they dared to ask a question that a lot of people in ivory towers had already been asking. Is God dead? In the modern age, was there any proof that God exists? Or was he just a fairy tale dreamed up to make us feel better about the brutality of human existence? Today, on It Is Written, we're going to look at one of the most fundamental questions ever asked. Does God really exist? It has stood the test of time. God's book, the Bible. Still relevant in today's complex world. It is written. Sharing hope around the globe. Presented by Shawn Boonstra and Mark Finley. Does God really exist? Number 1 in the Big 5 Questions About Life.
A little while ago, I was flying across the country, and I discovered to my delight that my seatmate was a great travel companion. We shared a lot of common interests, so we were able to pass the time quite well. But then the subject of religion came up. "What do you do for a living?" she asked me. "Well," I said, "I'm a minister." "Wow," she said, "that's really interesting. I'm an atheist." "Really?" I asked. Because to be honest, I don't actually believe in atheists. Not if you define atheist as someone who knows for sure there is no God. As she started to explain her lack of faith, she said, "Listen, when I was a kid, some pretty awful things happened to me. And when I went to the minister looking for answers, he didn't have any. So even though today I find religion very interesting, I personally don't have much faith that God exists." So as it turns out, my new friend wasn't really certain that God doesn't exist. She was just disappointed with her experience. Today, Pastor Mark Finley and I are going to wrestle with one of the biggest philosophical questions of all time. Does God really exist? Mark, as always, I'm delighted that we can spend some time together today.
I'm delighted again, Shawn, to be able to have this dialogue about the existence of God.
Yeah, it's really one of the questions that has captivated philosophers and thinkers for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And you know, Mark, you've been in ministry now for going on 40 years. You've traveled the world, and I'm sure you've run into a lot of people who wrestle with that question. Does God really exist? And you know, Mark, I'm thinking in particular of a time when you addressed a group in Eastern Europe some time ago that claimed to be atheistic. They actually challenged you to prove that God exists, didn't they?
Well, Shawn, that was a fascinating experience. I was in Eastern Europe when the Berlin Wall fell. I began to work in Eastern Europe back in the late 80s, 87, 88, 89, under communism. And when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, I was preaching in Hungary and in the capital city of Budapest.
That must have been a remarkable experience.
It was remarkable. You know, thousands of people marched in the streets, and you saw during those years, right after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, this hunger for God. The universities opened up, and I was invited to come to numerous universities to speak to the students on the subject of God and the existence of God. And one of the things that happened was quite fascinating. The president of one of the universities in Hungary came to me, and he said, "Now, Dr. Finley, would you be willing to come and lecture at our university? And the subject is astronomy."
Astronomy. They didn't ask you about theology, but astronomy.
Well, he said, "I want you to show from astronomy that God exists."
Wow.
And, you know, I'm not an astronomer, but I did have a lecture, a slide lecture with my graphics and the computer on astronomy. So I agreed, and he said, "Now, but there's one caveat. We have an astronomer in the astronomy department at the university. You will speak on why God exists, then he will speak on why God doesn't exist." And I thought a minute about that, and I knew that I was being set up. And I said, "You know, I'm willing to do that on one condition. Since I am your guest, let your astronomer speak first. Let me speak second," you see. So he agreed. I got to the university that morning, and he met me at the door, and he said, "Now, there is a problem." And I thought he was going to cancel the lecture. I had no idea what the problem was. And he said, "Here's what the problem is." He said the astronomer had another appointment. He couldn't make it.
So he wasn't coming.
He wasn't coming. So I said, No problem. Give me 2 hours with the students, 1 hour to lecture and then another hour to answer questions. So I lectured during the first hour, and we talked about the heavens and the vastness of space and the evidence that God exists from design, the fact that where there is design, there must be a designer. Where there's creation, there must be a creator. And so we went over that evidence. At the end, I noted there was a section for the faculty. And one of the students kind of looked over at the faculty, and I knew he was prompted by some PhD faculty person that wanted to kind of tie me up.
So they were trying to set you up. This had all been arranged ahead of time.
For sure. And so one of the students stood up and he said, "Our famous, renowned Soviet astronaut, Yuri Gagarin, traveled into space. He didn't see God. Have you ever seen God?"
Wow.
And you know, there are times in your life where the God that you believe in gives you an idea. And I knew it, so I knew what they were doing. So I said, you know, before I answer that question, I do have a question that I want to ask the faculty. And then I'll go to students' questions. And I said, faculty, let's leave God out of the question. Let's leave the Bible out. I'm a believer. You folk are not believers. But let's leave all that out. I just want to ask you one philosophical question. Of all the knowledge in the world, how much do your students have? Do they know 50% of all there is to know? Do they know 80% of all there is to know? You know, how much do they know?
These were some pretty bright students.
Extremely brilliant. And so I said, look, let me give you an example. Let's take the 16th Ming Dynasty of China. Can you give me, in order, the 17 emperors in the 16th Ming Dynasty?
Now, Pastor Mark, I can't name one of them. Not one of them.
I'd be hard-pressed as well, sure. Then I said, now, what about the caliphs of Saudi Arabia in the 7th century A.D.? Can you list for me, please, the first 15 caliphs in order, list who their wives were, who their children were? Of the 1,500 known languages in the world, how many do you speak? Do you speak 1,300 of those? If you had a test by the leading astrophysicist in the world, how much would you know? Can you recite for me now the chemical compounds in order, and then describe for me? And, you know, they saw where I was going. And I said, of all the knowledge in the world, say of all the books in the world, just printed this year, how many have you read?
Amazing.
Let's say that you know 50% of all there is to know. From an intellectual standpoint, professors, you're grading these students. Do they know 50% of all there is to know? They said no. Do they know 30% of all there is to know? No. Do they know 20% of all there is to know? No. I'm going to give your students the benefit of the doubt and say this is such a prestigious university that your students know 5% of all there is to know. That means you don't know 95% of all there is to know.
That's a lot you don't know.
Now, if you, by your own admission, only know 5% of all there is to know, and if by your own admission you don't know 95% of all there is to know, is it possible intellectually that God exists in the 95% of the knowledge you don't have? Intellectually, is that possible?
Sure.
And I saw these atheistic professors, Sean, it was amazing. They were shaking their heads. They knew intellectually in their minds that that was a reasonable argument, that if I only have 5% of the base of knowledge and I don't have 95%, it is possible. Then I said to them, if you acknowledge that, you are not an atheist. Because an atheist says, I know for absolutely sure God doesn't exist. Now, what you're saying is that he may exist, but he may exist in the knowledge I don't have. Then I said, now I have another question for you. Let's suppose that in life there are only two alternatives. First, there is no God. You are here by evolutionary...